Welcome to episode 9 of Belpod, the podcast dedicated to Belarusian football. Today we'll start by looking at the contrasting fortunes of two under-pressure BPL coaches, before considering whether Belarus's ailing economy will spell the beginning of the end for state-financed football. We'll follow that with the first of our Clubs in Focus series, with John taking a closer look at Smorgon, before shifting our attention to our favourite fullbacks in the BPL. Jacob Barnas will join Dan with his thoughts on refereeing in Belarus, and we'll finish with our thoughts on the 2021 Cup finalists and the standout games of Matchday 8. Hello again, welcome back, and we thought we'd start by talking about a bit of managerial turmoil in the BPL, which I suppose was always going to happen sooner or later, wasn't it, John? I think we'll start by talking about Mr. Kovalevich at Neman. A little bit of information coming out from Andrei Lazlovsky's fascinating article that we read earlier on this week on Tribuna. He seems to have resigned before, but maybe this time he's definitely going.
Well, not any time soon, of course, because the board of directors refused his resignation on Monday and said that his performance would be evaluated at the end of the first cycle of results. You're right, he did resign once before, I think in 2019, and that was refused as well. He's clearly been unhappy for a while. He lost all his star players from last season. The funding's been cut for the club, and he's got a much more difficult job there this season, and Neman have had a really slow and in some games really unlucky start. I think they've only really been done down at Gomel, otherwise they've been in every game that they've played. So I think Kovalevich is right to offer his resignation, but I think it's a measured and weighted decision, as someone said on Twitter, for the board to give him a bit more time and see if he can turn things around. So it'll be interesting to see how things go.
Yeah, very interesting article, as I mentioned, by Andrei Mazlovsky. I remember his article last season on Bate, which was really an excellent read. And I was amused as well. He mentioned Neman in the context of three other disappointments for him this season, other than Neman. I was particularly amused that our friends at Vitebsk Nil got another mention. And apparently Vlad Tata said that it was more fun to watch a cat asleep than watch Vitebsk this season. I think we agree with Vlad on that, don't we? But another interesting situation developing at Sputnik with our friend Mr. Levchuk and his gingerbread truck, in that he again seems to be out, or is he not? Sergei Azarkovich wrote about it this week, but it's difficult to know what's going on, really, isn't it?
Well, Vlad Tata broke this story on his Telegram channel on Monday, and it is a confusing situation. According to Tata, the board were very unhappy after the defeat up at Smorgon. They decided they wanted to make a change then, and they called a meeting on Monday to try and resolve it, but this was inconclusive. However, rumours on the internet on Tuesday suggested that Viktor Kumikov, the former Shakhtar Karaganda coach, was already taking Sputnik's training on Tuesday. So whilst Levchuk officially is still head coach, that's like saying, Erich Honecker is still officially president of East Germany. So he officially has a position, but he's going to be moved out of it very soon. And Kumikov will become the new head coach there. It's interesting, isn't it, Liam? This is one of the real differences between our leagues in England and Scotland and Belarus. When a manager gets sacked here, he's out. It's all over. And you've got the goalkeeping coach or someone like that in Sky Sports looking shamefaced and saying, oh, we're very sorry we got the manager sacked and we're going to do our best this evening before the new guy comes in. In Belarus, it takes a long time to move somebody on, and it's a process rather than the event it is here.
And interesting, in this same article by Azarkovich, he did mention he felt that Sputnik were almost a victim of their own success, and perhaps Levchuk to a certain extent as well, in that they've grown too quickly in a way. And we have seen signs of that, haven't we? In the fact that they were no longer able to play in Machica because the ground wasn't really good enough, had to be demolished, and they'd have to start all over again if they wanted to play there. So then they decided to head to Gomel, but then the local business in Machica decided, well, we don't want to support you anymore. And that's why they've ended up in this mess, really, haven't they? Which is a shame, because a lot of that success is down to Levchuk, and now he finds himself slightly hoist by his own petard in this situation.
It is a shame. He's done a great job there. We shouldn't forget that they won the league in the second tier very stylishly last season. And yes, you're right. I mean, the withdrawal of Recit Sadrev, the big furniture company, from sponsoring the club was a hammer blow at Christmas time. And they're living from hand to mouth. I mean, part of the Belarus NEF grant is basically keeping them afloat this season. The worrying thing for me, if I was a Sputnik fan, would be that the club appears to have no link with its own town anymore. And it's basically just living out the back of a car in FC Gomel's car park at the moment, more or less. And there's a lot of work to be done if the club is to have a long-term future, unfortunately, beyond this season.
Talking of long-term futures, obviously more worrying signs behind the scenes. We don't like to be doom and gloom, do we? But clearly the Belarusian economy is not in great shape at the moment and doesn't look like it's going to be in great shape anytime soon. And clearly this might perhaps herald the beginning of the end for state-run football, do you think, John? Because a lot of teams are going to have to fight for themselves. And we've already seen the pro-government letter that clubs have been asked to sign to keep their funding as it stands. But the suggestion is that long-term, maybe they're going to have to find other ways to make do without the help of the state.
Well, this is pretty raw politics, and Vlad Tătar said a few weeks ago that the crisis had finally come to football and overtaken it. And football is a mirror, as we've said before, of what's going on elsewhere in the country. Apparently, maternity payments and pensions were delayed this month for the first time in years. There was a very sobering article written by an economist advising Belarusians to withdraw money from their bank accounts before they're raided to keep the state afloat. And I think this is linked in with the pro-government letter. The authorities demanded at least 12 signatures per club. Otherwise, state funding would be removed. And in many cases, for clubs entirely dependent on state funding, that would mean that they would fold. They wouldn't make next weekend. So I think a lot of the players, even if they don't believe in the government, signed the letter to keep the clubs afloat, at least in the short term. In the medium term, the state can't keep paying lock, stock and barrel for professional football, and that the clubs have to find a way to make themselves at least partly economically self-sustaining. So many of these clubs aren't. They're still seen, as they were in the Soviet era, as a community asset and something for the benefit of the community who's worked hard all week, wherever, to come and enjoy themselves on a Saturday. And whilst that's a lovely idea, in 2021, it's increasingly not very sustainable. And when you have a state that's running out of money, but responsible for paying for so much of the lives of its citizens, then I'm afraid football's going to be amongst the first of the things that really feels the pinch.
Certainly, they've mentioned reductions in support for other sports as well. So it's not just that they're turning on football, is it? Naturally, as you say, it's a leisure pursuit. In terms of the government's priorities, clearly paying maternity leave, etc., is going to be more important to them. So we can understand that situation. Obviously, it won't necessarily have the same effects on all teams, because some teams, obviously Krumkachi, aren't too bothered about it. Some of the teams that are supported by very wealthy individuals, such as Dinamo Minsk and Brest, of course, will not be so affected. But obviously, we want to see the league remain a competitive league, and obviously, we don't want to see a league of 8 teams in which only 3 have any chance of winning it, and the other 5 are just there to make up the numbers. So we'll see what happens. But clearly, we need to be aware that things may change, in the medium term, and we may start to see the effects of that in the short term. Anyway, moving on to our feature that we promised to bring you this week. We said we'd kick off with a team that, as far as we know, doesn't have a massively big online presence, and certainly doesn't have a Twitter account related to it in English, and that's Smorgon. And so John, as a way of getting things started on this particular feature that we want to work on and want you to contribute to in future weeks, sat down and did his research and came back with this report on the town of Smorgon.
The town of Smorgon dates from the 16th century. It was once the site of an important Polish-Lithuanian castle, Krawa, whose ruins are one of the town's attractions today. The visible intersections of history between Lithuania, Poland, Russia, Germany and Belarus all cast long shadows here, in a town which is by some distance the smallest in the top flight, with just 37,000 inhabitants. A tourist can probably see most of Smorgon's attractions in an afternoon. There's the rare, very old Church of St. Michael the Archangel, one of the very few remains of Renaissance times in Belarus. You can walk along the river Oksna. You can visit German gun emplacements from 1915, when Smorgon was the First World War's Stalingrad. Defenders of the city held out against the invader for 810 days. You can have a photo taken with a bronze bear statue, a legacy of the Cruel Bear Academy from the 18th and 19th centuries, when the captured animals were made to dance for entertainment. The bear is everywhere, from the town's coat of arms, to the sparsely packaged Soviet-era ice cream, to the badge of the football club itself. Bears, fortunately these days, are left well alone in the abundant forests and nature reserves surrounding the place. It's hard not to feel a little sympathy for the coach and players caught in the middle of political machinations over which they have no control at the footballing Bears. Certainly, Smorgon have improved after starting the season very cold indeed. The side looked miles out of its depth in the opening games against Energetic and Izloj, and more recently in an abject demolition by the scarcely impressive Ruch Brest. But the recent victory over Sputnik and very creditable performance last weekend against Bata Borisov in a narrow 1-0 defeat suggests that the Bears may not be as dead as they first appeared. Gerashchenko has pulled strings and done his best with an expanded playing budget. He re-signed local hero Leonid Koval and made the experienced striker club captain. Gerashchenko persuaded Christian Intsoin to sign from Krumkachi, and the defence, melding together, has developed a real African tang with the addition of Burkina Faso left-back Ben Aziz Dao. In the middle of the park, Cameroonian anchor Yamusa Kamara has consistently caught the eye with a series of steady and athletic performances. Alongside Koval up front, an eye-catching signing has been the capture of former Rubin Kazan prospect Artur Sagitov. And it's not just new signings who've been charged with making the club more competitive on the pitch as the season develops. Pavel Shecherbachenya, now 2 years into his second spell as Smorgon's goalkeeper, has impressed with some very good performances so far. The same can be said for the youngsters Alexander Frantsev at right back, and in particular left-winger Daniel Kopacz, a bustling, low centre of gravity forward with boundless energy. Smorgon's first home game against Sputnik, in front of a raucous crowd of a few hundred on a terrible grey day of rain and sleet, was very interesting. The new park held up well, and the ground has a rustic air. A dismal Sputnik side wilted under Smorgon's determination and relentless attacking. The journalists who visited were full of incredulity at the vegetable garden within the boundary of the stadium and the closeness of the players to the fans. Smorgon is small enough for more or less everybody to know everybody. It's similar to Hereford being promoted to the English Premier League or Stirling Albion to the equivalent of Scotland. If a squad steadily improving in quality can harness that home energy at the UNOS, then maybe people will just start believing that the Bears won't be taking a revolving door exit back to the Pershaya at the end of this year.
Very interesting, John. Looking forward now to adding that to yet another list that I've made up of all the places I want to go to in Belarus. I didn't even know where Smorgon was 6 months ago. It's interesting, isn't it? Certainly the town itself sounds like it's worth a visit, albeit a relatively short one in terms of historic monuments, etc. But I think this team is not perhaps out of it in terms of staying up. And my view on them has changed quite rapidly since that game. Sputnik were the ideal opposition in terms of perhaps the weakest team in the league. But they certainly impressed me that day. And I started to think, not many teams are going to fancy coming here.
I agree with you. Smorgon looked, as I said in the report, horrifically out of their depth in the first few games. And it did look like it would just be a sort of weekly training exercise for most clubs in the league. But I've liked the way Gerashichenko's gone about his business. He's got this kind of careworn appearance as though he's a Red Army doctor bringing in other people, badly wounded people that he's got to work for 48 hours to fix. But I like the way that he's brought in, for example, this guy Sagatov. And is that, wait a minute, that guy's at Rubin Kazan. How can you afford that? But somehow he's pulled strings and been able to bring him in, at least for the first round of games. So I like the way he's doing things. And I agree with you, that's a really raucous atmosphere up there, Partizan. It's a very good pitch there. So I don't think the superstars will be too put out by the pitch they have to play on. But yes, turning up to play a Premier League game in the equivalent of a British non-league ground will be an eye-opener for a lot of people. And I think Smorgon's aim, like Sputnik's and others, will be to finish 13th or give themselves a chance in the relegation playoff and survive it. And if they can do that, well, that's job done for the coach and for the club authorities.
I noticed with great interest there that you mentioned Benaziz Dow, who I know initially when you saw him play, symptomatic really of how poorly we rated Smorgon in those early weeks. He looked completely out of his depth, didn't he? But has got better recently. Not yet probably make it into your list of top two fullbacks. And that leads us very nicely into the next thing we want to talk about, which is the position analysis that we started last week with goalkeepers. And this week we're going to talk about fullbacks. Or really, we want to talk about whether there is such a thing as a fullback anymore, John, in Belarus or indeed anywhere else in the world.
Well, yes, it goes back to when I grew up watching football and started in the early 1980s. A fullback tended to be the slowest player in the team, usually with a raggedy moustache and with the general appearance of a piece of misshapen plasticine, but someone who was really hard as nails and really knew how to mark a player and stick to a player in the penalty box. This, of course, is a very old-fashioned conception of a fullback now, and it doesn't exist anymore. Wing backs are all the rage these days and have been for about a decade, maybe even 15 years, I would say. And there are one or two really good examples of that, but there are still some interesting old-fashioned fullbacks in the league too, as you'd expect. I mean, I don't know, Liam, who have you picked out to focus on in this segment?
It's very interesting, actually. If I had to name my favourite two fullbacks, they are very, very contrasting figures in their teams for me. Although, interestingly, my first one, Andrei Vasiliev at Neyman, I think Neyman really essentially usually play a back four, but you wouldn't say that Andrei Vasiliev was a fullback because he generally spends most of his game in the other half. So he is, for me, the archetypal rock solid, hard as nails, don't come near me or I'll probably bite your legs off sort of fullback. And he's not a bad player either, which is what I like about him. Definitely a different end of his career, not old at 29, but definitely a different stage of his career from my other particular fullback that I've noticed. And he's very definitely a wingback, and that's Ivan Dibango at Izloch, who again has massive boots to fill in terms of Godfrey Stevens' performances last year for Izloch. He's only 19 years of age and has come in so far and been really, really impressive in a series of high-profile games. So it does show that within this league, we do have some very contrasting styles of perhaps more old-fashioned fullback, but also wing-backs. And even the fact we can talk about a fullback in a back four who essentially plays more like a wing-back, as you say. The notion of a fullback who just stays in his own half and kicks people just doesn't really exist anymore, does it? Who's impressed you in terms of fullbacks that you've seen, or wing-backs, or whatever we wish to call them?
Well, just so any of our listeners in the Tebs aren't too raging, to say something positive, their sort of heartbeat is Artem Skitov, who's been at Vitebsk roughly since the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a one-club man. And he is someone who does largely stay in his own half. Viteb's defence is very miserly, so that does suggest that they're doing something right, at least at that end of the park. And of course, Dimi Gushchenko in goals had a great season, but Skitov has been an important part of that too, as captain of that side. I think, though, at the other end of the spectrum, You have Nikola Antic at Shakhtar Sologorsk, who I think is a wonderful player, very effective defender, organises the defence very well, quite quick too. When he has to bomb forward, he can, but that's not a big part of his game. Rather than bombing forward, I think the important attacking feature of his game is his free kicks. And of course, you remember the free kick he scored recently against Smorgon, I think it was, which was a real classic of the genre. I think Ronaldo would have been proud of that one. So he's really impressed me, and he's a cornerstone, I think, of Shakhtar Sologorsk's challenge this season. I mean, on the other side of the Shakhtar defence, of course, you've got Gleb Shevchenko, who's very different to the role he played at Slavia Mostar. He is a young man who's been brought in to play as the young player in the side, and he's very effective at getting forward. And he's really developed that side of his game this year, probably with better coaching. So he's been interesting to watch too.
He's one, isn't he? Definitely who I felt at the start, he looked completely out of his depth. I felt that, not unsurprisingly, the guy's been playing a holding central midfield role, and he's suddenly been asked to play at right back. And we were a bit suspicious. And obviously, Begunov at the time complained about the fact that he was only really in the team because he was the young player that is now required by the regulations. But I have to say, against Rook, he was absolutely outstanding. And he was
very good. Yeah, and I think for me, Liam, without wishing to sound too much of a Scottish Presbyterian, he just was bone idle at Slavia. He was so lazy. If you remember the first goal he conceded against Energetic up in Molodechno last season, that was his fault. And he was just a slow pass back. He wasn't even looking, but he's obviously under so much more pressure to deliver at Shakhtar. And that's actually, regardless of the problem with the limiter rule, which is daft, nonetheless, in that pressure cooker atmosphere, it's really developing him significantly,
So it's features galore this week. We've got that feature, which is obviously 2 weeks old now, and we've got a new feature on club-specific details. But we're going back now to one of our tried and trusted, our longest-standing feature, John, an interview with a BPL fan. And on this occasion, we've managed to nab a BPL fan from all the way from the other side of the Atlantic for us in the UK. And he resides in Edmonton. And Jacob Barnas is now going to give us a different slant on his particular interest in watching the BPL over the last 12 months.
Jacob, welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, you were one of many people who joined us last year in supporting the Belarusian Premier League. We're now a year on, and you still haven't picked a team. You're trying to claim that that's deliberate, and I'll let you have that. But you have obviously an interest in the game that is slightly different to probably quite a lot the rest of us. Do you want to explain a bit about what you do in your hometown?
Sure. So I am a referee, a regional level referee with the Alberta Soccer Association in Canada, here in Edmonton, across the pond from where most of you guys live. I've been refereeing since I was 16 years old, and I do it just as I used to play, and I was never really good, but I wanted to do something at a higher level in the game, so I started refereeing. And just like everyone else, once football disappeared in the world, I've found my refuge in Belarus.
And I think it's that refereeing aspect that has actually been quite interesting. There's been a number of conversations we've had over the weeks and months where you've been able to express that specific viewpoint. And we thought it'd be quite interesting to get you on and talk through a bit more about refereeing in the game in Belarus. What's your thought on the general standard of refereeing if you were to compare it to, I don't know, say the Premier League or the MLS, for example, which we might be a bit more familiar with?
For sure. So as for the standard, I think the standard is decent. I haven't watched it and said, wow, but I don't think it inhibits the watchability of the game either. I think the refereeing in Belarus is different than it is to the MLS and the Premier League. And I think that's what maybe some fans it took some getting used to. I have some stats here. The average number of yellow cards per game in Belarus is higher than that of any referee in the Premier League at all. So it's clear that the style of refereeing in Belarus is they tend to show a lot more yellow cards. They tend to be more strict on things like dissent or petulant things like kicking the ball away, delaying the restart, and whatnot. And that results in having more yellow cards. For example, on average in the MLS, which is kind of the league, my home league that I follow, there's 1 second yellow card every 17 games, whereas in Belarus, that's 8. So there's almost double the amount of second yellow cards in Belarus. And I think that's mainly, the reasons for that are manifold. I think one of them is a cultural difference. If you look at the leagues in Europe that have the highest totals for yellow cards, those leagues almost are exclusively Eastern Europe and Spain. And what do those countries have in common? Well, they were all under a dictatorship. So I think that attitudes towards authority in these countries could potentially have an impact on how the game's refereed there. That referees that grew up in a certain in a country which has a certain attitude towards the way authority ought to be treated, that permeates the refereeing of football in that given country.
Okay. And do you think that's as much down to the players or as the referees, do you think?
I don't particularly think that the football in Belarus is any dirtier or any more physical than that in the Premier League or the MLS. You know, you see some crunching challenges here and there, but it's not particularly bad. I think it's more down to the way that Belarusian referees are trained and the way that Belarusian referees are taught to manage a game.
Okay, and let's say I managed to arrange it for you to be flown into Belarus next Sunday to referee the Shakhtar Bate game. How do you think you'd influence that game with your style of refereeing, or flipping it round, if you will? Do you think the refereeing in Belarus would potentially influence your style of refereeing?
Well, given the fact that I'm only 20 years old, I'm still really molding my style of refereeing. And when football came back in the fall here in Canada for a little bit, I had shown more yellow cards in those games after it came back than I ever had in the past. So I think it's fair to say that the Belarusian football has influenced my style a little bit. In my opinion, you have to strike a happy balance between, not overdoing with the yellow cards and sending players off for no reason, but you also have to ensure that bad behavior doesn't get a pass in the game and such that a good player's ability to play properly is stymied, because when good players get frustrated because they're being fouled all the time, that really hinders the quality of the game. So generally, I think the referees in Belarus do a decent job of ensuring that, maybe a couple of times you see a game with 10, 11 yellow cards and you think that they're overdoing it a little. But I think generally speaking, I don't think that the standard is particularly poor. As for refereeing Bate Shakhtar, I mean, those games, if you look at the past, those games tend to have 8 to 10 yellow cards every single time, just because of how competitive and how physical they are. And, only the best referees in the league get selected to those games.
Let's put yourself to one side for a moment. You're now in selecting the referee for that game. Who out of the referees that you've seen do you think would be fitting to referee a game like that?
I mean, my favorite referee in Belarus, I think he's incredibly talented, is a man from Gomel. His name is Amin Kurgeli. I have never seen, and I've watched football in several leagues, I have never seen a more fit referee than him. I watched the cup final he did last year, for example, between Bate and Dinamo Brest, and he was running around the pitch for 120 minutes in ways that, I don't think players would have the energy to do. He's truly talented. He's a very good game manager. Like I said, his fitness is unrivaled. It's really quite wonderful to see someone like him. I honestly think he has a very bright future, given the fact he's only 29 years old and he's already refereeing the top games in the country. I honestly think we could see him in the Champions League or refereeing international football at a high level one day, because I think he's very good. Besides that, I think Denis Sherbakov, obviously our favorite cult figure, Lantern Jalbinpol. I think, he's a good referee. He hasn't had the best season so far. He's made a couple of errors in his games, but we love him for a reason, right? So I think he's also quite decent.
Okay, and rather than focusing on any particular performances of the teams, etc., every weekend I think we as fans will pull apart a referee's performance from our own slightly tilted view, if you will, depending on which teams are playing. Let's talk about one of the games from the weekend, which I think had a couple of calls that were being debated quite a lot in the Discord server. Neymar versus Islop. Now, we had 2 penalties in that for handball. What was your view on those? I think the first one came about the 62nd minute and gave Islok their second goal. What was your view on that one?
Yeah, so that one, based on what I saw, I didn't think it was the correct decision. The camera angles weren't the best for that clip. Maybe there was something there that had the camera angle been better. Maybe there was a slight movement by Sadovnichi's arm there. But based on what I saw, it looked like an arm which came to him from close range from his teammate. His arm was in a natural position, and I simply don't see any evidence that that was a handling offense. There's no extension from the body based on what I see. There's no deliberate motion. It just kind of hits him as it's by his side. So I personally believe that was an incorrect decision from our referee, Anton Lashuk, in that one.
And then we had another one for Neyman this time on the 78th minute. Your views on that one?
That one, I think, is correct in that Anton Kovalev for Isloch went down a slide to block a cross. And as he went down a slide, he raised his arm above his torso, above his body. And there are 2 kind of ways to interpret a handball. One is deliberate. And the other aspect is he outstretching his arm from his body in a manner which is, he is taking a risk. He is assuming the risk of having a handball called against him by having his arms in that position. And Kovalev's handball is a foul for the latter reason, in that when he slides, his arm is raised above his chest. And when he does so, he assumes the risk of having a penalty called against him if that cross happens to hit his arm. And that's precisely what happened. The ball hit his arm and bounced away, and the referee correctly called a penalty against Isloch, in my opinion.
I've asked you a lot about the refereeing, so I want to kind of maybe just give you a last chance before we draw this to an end. Do you want to give us a bit of a view, if you will, of where you think that this season might end up? A chance to speak more broadly about the clubs and where the table might finish.
I don't even think we have a good barometer for Shakhtar yet. Their game against Rook, they were immaculate. And they also have games where they barely eke out a 2-1 victory against Sputnik like they did last week. That being said, obviously they're 100%. I think this week against Bate will really will truly tell us how good Shakhtar really are. And I think if they win against Bate convincingly, I don't see any way of saying they're not going to win the title this year. I still have hope in Dinamo Minsk. I predicted them at the beginning of the season, and Bang, after starting at striker the last couple of games, looks very good. He looks like he's their talisman up front. And they still have to play 2 games against Shakhtar. I think that if Dinamo Minsk could get 4 points against Shakhtar in those 2 games, I think that they also have a running shot at the title. Should Shakhtar drop points against other teams? We still have not seen any of the games between the top 3, and that's Shakhtar, Dinamo Minsk, and Bate, which are the teams that I expect to be the top 3 at this point in the season. So it's very early to decide. But for now, my heart says Dinamo Minsk, but my brain is saying Shakhtar at this point to win the title.
Great stuff, Jacob. Really, really enjoyed listening to you there. I think you've been caught out though. I heard right at the end, the heart says Dinamo. Right at the start, Dan said to you something about you said you haven't chosen a team yet. I think maybe you've given yourself away there. But some fascinating information with regard to yellow card statistics and the suggestion, the notion that maybe the Eastern Bloc countries and Spain are particularly ruthless with their yellow cards in terms of the referee's attitude because of the history of the countries. An interesting idea, may well be true. Your thoughts on the 2 referees you mentioned, Kurgali and our friend Dennis? I think I know what you're going to say about Dennis, but what about Mr. Kurgali?
Yes, I agree with what Jacob had to say. I think he's a very good referee, and the fitness levels are so important. I think the best thing you can say about a referee at the end of the game is shake his hand if you're a coach or an assistant or an unused substitute, and shake his hand and say, "Great game, I never noticed you." Because you're not meant to notice the referee. The referee is there to facilitate the game between the 2 sets of players and make sure the laws are observed. So I think Kurgali's one of those, you often just don't notice him, or you just notice him gently nudging things on and then fading into the background. And Big Dennis, of course, is just a legend. You love to see him. He's got a little bit of theatricality about him. He likes playing up to his image a wee bit. But he's also scrupulously fair. And what I like about Dennis as well is he's one of those referees who doesn't indulge play acting and simulation. He's really quite hard on that. And I think in a lot of the games I've seen, there's less simulation or having been taken out by a heavy caliber rifle from 2 miles away when the opponent hasn't even touched you. There's less of that in the games when Dennis is around. I really appreciate him. And even when he gets it wrong occasionally, and he is prone to the occasional high-profile clanger, a little bit like Kalina was in his time in Italy. I think he's a similar figure to Kalina in some ways, but with a moustache instead of being bald.
Jacob mentioned there, of course, Chielli's performance in the cup final last year, the 120 minutes in which he never stopped running. And I do remember that was a magnificent feat of fitness, if nothing else, from him. And obviously mentioning the cup final, we now have a cup finalist for this season. And whilst I think we all expected the 4-1 deficit from the first leg to be too much for Torpedo to overturn, got a little bit of a surprise in the other one. Although, John, you have been predicting it for the last couple of weeks, haven't you, in the Islot Shakhtar tie?
It's wonderful to see Slots through to the final and just something a bit different. I mean, no offense to the Shakhtar-minded listeners, but just for something a bit different, you know. And I think it's going to make for quite a romantic story in the final, you know, that Vitaly Zhukovsky took his Slots to the quarters and led Bata to the final. And you know, he's had a hand in both those teams making that game, which is very, very unusual. And yeah, your friend Dibango, who you were mentioning there in the fullback section, of course, got the opener. And Islach closed out the game really effectively. I do question, Liam, how much Shakhtar cared about that game. I know the coach rested some players on Saturday for the Sputnik game, and he did put out a strong side, but they just didn't seem committed. And I do wonder if at the back of their minds they're keeping their focus on their league challenge, where they still have a 100% record, and future endeavours in Europe.
Big shout out to Yusuf as well, though. I mean, he missed an absolute, didn't miss it, but he went around the keeper and dillied and dallied and messed it up completely and got it blocked on the line. I thought, how on earth did he miss that? 25 seconds later, he's turning and rifling the winner into the bottom corner. So definitely no sort of psychological hangover from the absolute howling mistake that he made by not scoring it the first time. He just went back and did it properly the second time, which was great. And of course, that leads us on to some really interesting matches this weekend, doesn't it, John? Because we've got Shakhtar against Barty, which is, to me, is the biggest game of the season. And all of a sudden, Shakhtar going into that game thinking maybe they're not invincible, are they? They've just lost to Islach. Never mind the fact that they didn't seem desperately bothered about that. And meanwhile, Islach, who are cock a hoop, no doubt, go and have to face Dinamo Minsk, who are on their own little revival. And so those two ties for me are really two that stand out this weekend.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, of course, Shakhtar Bata is the game of the season so far. I think it's going to have a huge bearing on whether Bata can really put a serious title challenge together, or whether, as I was predicting before the season, they were going to have quite a big flat spell at some point with so many new players. Yes, the psychological thing, I don't think that will bother Shakhtar. I think they'll have an analysis of what went wrong tomorrow, and they'll be absolutely bursting to put that right in such an important fixture at the weekend. And don't forget, of course, the other serious game they've played against Ruch. They shredded Ruch. They really did. So it's a really tough game for Bata. And you have to say, if we're talking about tests for Shakhtar, the first real test for Bata Borisov this season as well, since, of course, the Super Cup game. And Vitaly's team have been bubbling along quite nicely, but they've not been playing huge sides, you have to say, so far. And I think Vitaly will come away from that game with a point, quite happy, just to stop the 100% record, get in Shakhtar's heads a little bit, and to keep the gap at 4 points, and to put a bit of psychological pressure on Roman Grigorchuk.
On the flip side of that, John, do you think that, as Jacob suggested, if Barty go to Shakhtar and get an absolute tonking, do you think that's pretty much game over in terms of the league, or is it too early to be saying that?
It's just, come on, it's too early after 8 games. Of course, it's going to be a massive step forward for Grigorchuk and his squad if they can swat aside Bata as they did with Ruch. And they are capable of doing so. We can't rule out that outcome. So let's see. Yes, if Shakhtar are 8 out of 8 at the weekend, then for the next Bell Pot, we'll be trying to work out ever more unlikely scenarios of how Bata or Dynamo Minsk get themselves back into the title race. So let's see. It's going to be a really fascinating game. Izloch and Dynamo Minsk, I wonder if it might be a case of a little bit after the Lord Mayor's show for Izloch. You saw today how much that win and getting through to their first ever National Cup final meant to them. I'm sure there'll be a few celebrations tonight. And I think the notoriously austere Mr. Radkov might even allow himself an extra apple juice after that game. So you wonder how switched on they'll be against Dynamo. And Dynamo have looked really, really good in their last couple of games since Kuchuk has gone against his instincts and permitted a slightly more attacking intent. You've seen Jean Morel Poe really hit a hot streak of form, and also the impact that Mbeng, the new signing, is having on them going forward. And of course, Putzelo appearing in the middle of the park. So Dynamo, I think, just need to keep steadily accumulating wins and points and waiting for the top two to go through a bit of a rough patch to ensure that they're close enough where they might be able to take advantage, you know?
Yeah, I think Jacob's point about Dynamo potentially taking 4 points off Shakhtar and waiting for them to slip up elsewhere is a really relevant one. And they're not a million miles away. They're 7 points behind, I think, at the moment, aren't they? But ultimately, the issue is they need to keep on winning games like this one away Izloch, don't they? Otherwise, they'll just be dropping the same points that Shakhtar are dropping, and taking 4 points off Shakhtar will make not a jot of difference because they'll be too far away to be in the final reckoning. I suppose the other interesting game that we haven't even really specifically focused on this week is two teams we've already mentioned quite a lot in this particular episode, and that's Smorgon and Neman. Obviously, Neman going to Smorgon fresh from the back of the coach's resignation having been rejected. If Smorgon turn them over, who knows? He might go back again, despite the promise that he's got the whole of the first half of the season to see how he gets on. I suspect if Smorgon do inflict a defeat on him, maybe he'll go and have another conversation with the regional committee. And Smorgon, obviously, I think will fancy that one, won't they?
They will fancy it, and I think not only did Smorgon do well against Sputnik, they also really gave a good showing at Bata, and with a bit of luck, might have scraped a draw from that game. Bata weren't terribly impressive, and young Frantsev late on had a chance that, it was a difficult chance, but one that you really need to be taking in pressure situations like that. So yes, Smorgon are going to be right up for the game. They're going to have that partisan crowd behind them again. But if I were Kavalovic, I'd be winding my team up. It's like, guys, this is why you don't have so much money this season, because these, word we can't say in a family program, stole some of our budget so they can be in our league. So I think there'll be a bit of psychology and mind games and kidology there. And from Neyman's point of view, they're going to a club that struggled all season. And if they can't win there, then where are they going to win? I do also think that Neyman showed a great spirit in the last half hour against Izloch. And if they can start the game the way they finished the games against Energetic and Izloch, their last two, then they're going to be hard to live with. So it's a tricky one to predict. Let's see.
Indeed, and there's even more to come, really, isn't there, in this weekend? Before we even we've mentioned perhaps the biggest games, but then when we look at Rook against Sputnik, obviously we have to dispatch Sputnik. Yeah. Sputnik, hopefully, maybe if the new coach has had any sort of effect, they might be a little bit more secure at the back, which has obviously been the biggest problem. They come off the back of a heartening performance, being narrowly defeated by the champions last weekend, and obviously Dynamo Brest going down to Slavia Morzia, who again they've had a great start. Dynamo, obviously, we know that they have had issues before the start of the season, and they've started really promisingly. But if they really want to be in that European shake-up, they're drawn the last couple, haven't they? They need to just perhaps find a little bit more. And I don't think going to Moz is going to be easy. Meanwhile, obviously, Slavia, as we've said many times, underperforming, another one of those 4 teams mentioned by our friend Mr. Maslovsky in his 4 disappointments for the season. So, yeah, lots and lots of intrigue this weekend before we even, the main card we know is really going to be Shakhtar Barty and Izlov Dinamo, but so many on the undercard that seem interesting and fascinating encounters.
There's always, in this league, in the 8 fixtures, even if you look beyond the top 2 or 3, and there always are a top 2 or 3 every weekend, there's always an intrigue somewhere or a micro drama. And I think it'll be interesting to see how many of the games that you've mentioned there have play out. And Liam, I'm absolutely staggered and appalled that you haven't mentioned the key visit of Vitebsk to FC Minsk, which quite clearly is the game of the weekend. And we'll see what level of boredom that the 4 viewers worldwide are subjected to in that one.
I have to say, FC Minsk have almost looked a little bit more open recently, which is probably more of a concern to their coach. I thought the game against Torpedo, they actually looked like they were not that defensive at all. I don't know if he's been reading.
I agree, and Shecherbachenko will know how to break that defence apart with the resources at his disposal. And if you're watching that game, if you're struggling with insomnia or severe procrastination, then what you're hoping for is an early FC goal or 2, which will then force Vitebsk to be a bit more attacking and actually to cross the halfway line more than once every 45 minutes.
We'll be here as much as we can over the weekend, posting on Twitter and hopefully sharing some time with you on the live feeds. But in the meantime, take good care of yourselves.
Thanks very much for listening, guys, and look forward to seeing you next time.